"Your brother's trip is more important than your little party," Mom texted. By sunrise, my parents had already boarded a plane with him, leaving my wedding day completely empty. They had decided that my marriage was nothing more than a small event they could easily skip so they could take care of their favorite son, Julian. I had no father waiting to walk me down the aisle, no mother beside me, and no family support when I needed it most. In the end, I had to take the arm of a man I had met only 3 weeks earlier. I forced myself to smile, marry the man I loved, and tried to push my family's rejection out of my mind. But by Monday morning, a casual 10-second video from our ceremony had unexpectedly reached 1 million views online. Then my phone began ringing nonstop. Mom called me 61 times in 1 hour, and when I finally answered, her voice was trembling with panic. "Your father's billionaire boss just saw the video. He recognizes your husband, and your father is about to lose everything. My name is Clara. I'm 27 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, and stayed patient, my parents would eventually notice me. But that was never how things worked in our family. My younger brother, Julian, was always the center of attention. He was the son everyone protected, while the rest of us were expected to quietly live in his shadow. If Julian struggled in one class, my parents immediately hired 3 tutors. When I earned an academic scholarship, they barely looked up from whatever they were doing and gave me a distracted. Eventually, I stopped expecting anything from them and learned to build my own happiness. That was how I eventually met Liam. Liam was everything my family had never been for me. He was patient, warm, supportive, and genuinely interested in building a future together. When he proposed, I allowed myself to believe that maybe this time my parents would finally be happy for me. I thought my engagement might be the one thing that brought our family together. Instead, my mother glanced at my modest ring and immediately asked whether we could move the wedding date. Julian, she explained, was planning a backpacking trip through Europe around the same time. I told her no. I had already chosen the date, and I wasn't going to rearrange one of the most important days of my life around another one of Julian's plans. Liam and I spent the next year carefully planning a beautiful, intimate ceremony with only the people who truly mattered to us. 2 nights before the wedding, my parents finally arrived in town. But instead of looking excited, they seemed distracted and bored. They spent most of the evening checking their phones, answering messages, and barely asking me anything about the wedding. I tried not to let it bother me. I kept telling myself that they were probably nervous or simply tired from traveling. But the real blow came the following night, just hours before I was supposed to exchange my vows. I was sitting alone in the bridal suite, making the final changes to my vows, when my phone buzzed. I looked down and saw a message from Mom. Julian's flight was rescheduled, and he needs us to fly to Madrid with him tonight to help him get settled. Your brother's trip matters more than your little party. We won't be there tomorrow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I read the message again and again, hoping I had somehow misunderstood it. A little party, that was what my wedding day meant to them. I sat in the quiet room staring at my phone while tears slowly ruined the makeup I had spent hours preparing. I had spent years making excuses for them, convincing myself that their behavior wasn't intentional. But that message made everything painfully clear. They had chosen Julian, once again, and this time they weren't even trying to hide it. The morning of my wedding arrived under a heavy, suffocating silence. Instead of the cheerful chaos that usually surrounds a bride getting ready with her family, my suite felt strangely empty, almost like a waiting room. My bridesmaids did everything they could to keep me distracted. They poured champagne, played upbeat music, laughed, and tried to make me smile. I appreciated every bit of it, but whenever my eyes landed on the empty chair where my mother should have been sitting, another wave of hurt washed over me. Their absence wasn't just emotional. It created a very real problem. My father had promised for months that he would walk me down the aisle. Now he was thousands of miles away, and I had no idea what I was supposed to do. The thought of walking toward Liam alone terrified me. There were only about 50 guests, which meant everyone would notice. Everyone would see that my parents were missing. I imagined the whispers, the uncomfortable looks, and the questions I would have to answer later. I didn't want anyone feeling sorry for me on my wedding day. I just wanted to walk down that aisle and marry the person I loved without my family's rejection becoming the center of attention. 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, someone gently knocked on the door. I assumed it was the wedding coordinator coming to tell me that it was time. Instead, the door opened and an older gentleman stepped inside. I immediately recognized him. It was Arthur, the man I had met exactly 3 weeks earlier at a quiet dinner Liam had. Liam had introduced him as a close family friend and mentor, someone who had supported him after Liam lost his own parents. I remembered Arthur as being polite but reserved, the kind of person who didn't need to speak loudly to command attention. That morning, he was dressed in an impeccably tailored classic tuxedo. His posture was calm and dignified, and there was something quietly reassuring about him. He looked around the room, noticed the empty chair, and then looked directly at me. My eyes were swollen from crying, and I knew I probably looked nothing like the confident bride I had imagined becoming. Arthur's expression softened as if he immediately understood what had happened without needing an explanation. He took a slow step toward me and spoke in a gentle, steady voice. "Clara," he said softly, "you don't have to face this moment alone." "Liam told me what had happened," Arthur said quietly. "If you'll allow me, it would be the greatest honor of my life to walk you down that aisle." I looked at him, and an overwhelming sense of relief washed over me. For the first time that morning, I didn't feel completely alone. I couldn't find the words to answer, so I simply nodded through my tears and gently took his offered arm. When the chapel doors finally opened, the soft notes of the bridal march drifted through the room. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. As I walked down the aisle, I stopped noticing the whispers and curious looks from guests who had clearly realized my parents were. None of that mattered anymore. My eyes were fixed on Liam, standing at the altar with tears in his eyes and a look of absolute love on his face. Arthur walked beside me with a calm, steady confidence that gave me the strength I needed. When we reached the altar, he carefully placed my hand into Liam's and leaned close enough to whisper a short blessing. Somehow, those few quiet words felt more like something a loving father would say than anything my own father had ever given me. The ceremony passed in what felt like seconds. It was filled with warmth, laughter, tears, and genuine happiness. The space my parents had left behind was quickly filled by Liam's friends and extended family, who welcomed me as if I had always belonged there. No one treated me like the abandoned bride. No one made me feel uncomfortable or pitted. They simply celebrated with us. Liam and I exchanged our vows, promising to stand beside each other through every difficult season life might bring. Then, after all the waiting and uncertainty, we were finally pronounced husband and wife. During the reception, one of my bridesmaids kept talking about the moment Arthur had appeared at the chapel doors. She said it had been one of the most touching things she had ever seen at a wedding. Almost on impulse, she pulled out her phone and recorded a short, high-definition 10-second clip of Arthur walking beside me as I entered the chapel. Later that evening, she uploaded it to her social media account with a simple caption about how family isn't always determined by blood, but by the people who choose to stand beside you when it matters most. None of us thought much about the video after that. We went back to celebrating. Liam and I laughed, danced, took pictures with our friends, and stayed up late enjoying every moment of our wedding night. We had no idea that those 10 seconds were quietly spreading across the internet while we celebrated. By Monday morning, everything had changed. The peaceful feeling of our wedding weekend was interrupted by the constant buzzing of my phone. It was sitting on the nightstand beside our bed, vibrating so aggressively that it nearly moved across the wooden surface. I opened my eyes against the morning sunlight and reached for it, assuming I would find messages from friends wishing us a happy honeymoon. Instead, my lock screen was filled with notifications. There were so many that I could barely read them before new ones appeared. The short video my bridesmaid had posted of Arthur walking me down the aisle had completely exploded overnight. Somehow, it had spread far beyond her followers and reached people all over the internet. The clip had already passed 1 million views, and the number was climbing every time I looked at it. Thousands of strangers were leaving comments praising the older man who had stepped in when my own father hadn't. Many were also criticizing my parents for choosing to leave their daughter alone on her wedding day. I sat up in bed, staring at the screen in disbelief. My heart was pounding as I showed the video to Liam. We watched it together, hardly saying a word, as the view counter continued climbing by thousands every few seconds. It was surreal seeing a private moment from our wedding suddenly become something strangers everywhere were discussing. But the attention from the internet was nothing compared to what happened next. A few minutes later, my phone started ringing again. Then it rang again and again. I glanced at the screen and froze when I saw who was calling. It was my mother. I had missed 3 calls already. Then another came through. Within minutes, the number of missed calls kept increasing. I finally answered. There was silence on the other end for several seconds before I heard my mother take a shaky breath. Her voice sounded nothing like the confident woman who had sent me that cruel message 2 nights before. She sounded frightened. "Clara," she said, barely above a whisper, "you need to listen to me. Something has happened because of that video." I sat completely still, looking at Liam. He immediately noticed the expression on my face and reached for my hand. My mother continued, her voice becoming more panicked with every word. Your father's employer saw it. He recognized Arthur. And Clara, he knows exactly who your husband is. My stomach dropped. Until that moment, I had thought the viral video was simply an embarrassing family story that strangers would eventually forget. I had no idea it was about to expose a connection that could destroy everything my parents had built. Suddenly, my phone screen changed from a flood of notifications to an incoming call. My mother's name appeared across the display. Before I could even process what I was seeing, the call ended, only for the phone to start ringing again seconds. She called 10 times, then 20, then 30. Within a single hour, her name appeared on my screen exactly 61 times. It was completely unlike her. Normally, she could take days to respond to one of my messages, so this frantic barrage immediately told me that something was seriously wrong. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before I finally swiped to answer. Clara, thank God you finally picked up, Mom shouted. Her voice was nothing like the controlled, dismissive tone I had grown used to hearing. She sounded panicked, almost hysterical, struggling to catch her breath between sentences. I barely had time to say hello before she launched into a frantic explanation. She wasn't calling to apologize for missing my wedding. She wasn't asking whether the ceremony had gone well or whether Liam and I were happy. Her entire focus was on the viral video that was spreading across the internet. You have to get that video taken down right now, Clara, she cried. It's ruining our lives. I immediately sat upright in bed and pulled the phone slightly away from my ear because she was practically screaming. What are you talking about, Mom? I asked, keeping my voice calm despite the confusion building inside me. She explained that she and my father were still at the airport in Madrid, and my father's phone had been ringing constantly since early that morning. At first, they couldn't understand what was happening. Then my father received an urgent call from the billionaire owner of the multinational company where he had worked for most of his career. It was a man my father had spent decades trying to impress and stay in the good graces of. The company owner had seen the viral wedding video while scrolling through his morning feed. He wasn't interested in our family drama, and he certainly didn't care about the reasons my parents had missed my wedding. What caught his attention was the older gentleman walking beside me. He recognized him immediately. The moment he realized who Arthur was, everything changed. Suddenly, people throughout the company were scrambling to understand what had happened, and my father was facing the possibility of losing his position because of the identity of the man he had ignored. He knows Arthur. My mother cried, her voice breaking. Clara, you don't understand what you've done. That man you had at your little party, his name is Arthur Vance. The name seemed to hang in the silence of my bedroom. I slowly turned toward Liam. He was sitting beside me, listening to every word. When our eyes met, he simply gave me a small, knowing nod. Suddenly, all the strange details about Arthur began to make sense. The quiet, modest man who had appeared at my wedding wasn't simply one of Liam's family friends. Arthur Vance was a legendary figure in the industry, a retired business titan whose investments had helped launch and expand several major companies. More importantly, he was the primary investor behind my father's corporation, the person whose financial backing had played a crucial role in keeping the business alive and growing. Arthur had never wanted public attention, which explained why Liam had always spoken about him so casually. But there was another detail I hadn't known. Arthur wasn't just Liam's mentor. He was Liam's maternal uncle, an intensely private man who avoided the spotlight but remained deeply protective of his family. He had spent years quietly supporting Liam without seeking recognition or publicity. My father's billionaire employer had recognized Arthur instantly in that 10-second video. He had seen one of the company's most influential financial figures stepping into the role of a father for an abandoned bride, and he wanted answers immediately. Within minutes, my father had been pulled into an emergency virtual. The billionaire wasn't interested in excuses. He wanted to know why his employee's family had publicly humiliated and deliberately abandoned the woman who had just married Arthur's nephew. The boss had immediately demanded an explanation. He wanted to know why his own employee's family had publicly insulted and deliberately excluded the daughter-in-law of one of the company's most powerful financial backers. The entire corporate hierarchy was suddenly in turmoil. By choosing Julian's casual backpacking trip over my wedding, my parents hadn't simply skipped a small family celebration. They had unknowingly offended the very family connected to the person who had enormous influence over my father's entire career. Overnight, My father's professional reputation was in serious danger, and the position he had spent decades building was suddenly at risk. All because, once again, they had treated me like an afterthought. "Clara, you have to fix this," Mom pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please call Arthur. Tell him it was all a misunderstanding. Tell him we never meant to offend anyone." For 22 years, I had desperately wanted to hear my parents admit that I mattered. I had spent so much of my life chasing their approval, hoping that one day they would finally look at me the way they looked at Julian. But listening to my mother beg now, I felt something completely different. There was no anger left in me, no desire to prove myself, just a quiet sense of closure. They had already made their decision when they boarded that flight to Madrid. They chose Julian's plans over one of the most important days of my life. I remember the exact words she had sent me. "Your brother's trip matters more than your little party." I took a slow breath before answering. "I'm not doing that, Mom," I said calmly. "You told me my wedding was just a little party. It turns out it was the one party you really couldn't afford to miss." There was silence on the other end of the line. Before she could respond, I ended the call. Then I blocked her number. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for an apology or hoping they would suddenly become the parents I had always needed. I was finally choosing myself. With Arthur's support and Liam beside me, we began building a future that had nothing to do with my parents' approval. We didn't need their money, their connections, or their permission to be happy. Arthur never treated us like charity cases or tried to control our lives. He simply offered guidance when we needed it and reminded me that family could be built through trust, loyalty, and love. My father eventually lost his position. The consequences of his choices caught up with him, and the reputation he had spent decades protecting could not survive the fallout. It was painful to watch, but I also understood that I wasn't responsible for fixing the consequences of decisions I hadn't made. My parents had spent years teaching me that Julian's needs came first. Eventually, I learned that my own life deserved to come first, too. Today, Liam and I live in a beautiful home filled with memories we created together. On our wall hangs one of my favorite wedding photographs. It shows Liam standing beside me, Arthur on my other side, and all three of us smiling after the ceremony. Whenever I look at that picture, I no longer think about the empty seats or the parents who didn't show up. I think about the people who did. That wedding taught me something I should have understood years earlier. Family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes the people who truly become your family are the ones who show up when everyone else walks away. Arthur wasn't my biological father, but on the most important day of my life, he gave me something my own father couldn't, a reason to feel supported instead of abandoned. So what would you have done if your family had walked away from you on your biggest day? Would you have forgiven them to protect their careers, or would you have finally walked away and chosen your own peace? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, check out the other incredible stories on your screen right now.